Kraków, the 24th of May 1945. The war in Europe ended barely 2.5 weeks ago, and the city still breathes with that strange silence of the first post-war days, when no one quite knows what to do with the information beginning to arrive from the liberated camps. In an improvised hearing room, with windows still bearing the marks of glass rationing and a stenographer barely able to keep up with every sentence, Judge Jan Sayan sits across from a 27-year-old man who answers his questions with a precision that makes everyone present uncomfortable. He does not cry. He does not pause to search for words. He describes the exact temperature of a cremation furnace, the order in which bodies were loaded, the time it took for a corpse to be consumed depending on its weight. He speaks of these things the way a technician would describe a machine he knows better than anyone else, because he operated it for almost 2 years, while most of the men who did the same work did not survive 3 months. The man's name is Henrik Tauber, and what he is about to tell Judge Sen is the most detailed description that exists of what happened inside the crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau. To understand how a young man from Krasnov became the witness who would reconstruct the exact mechanism of industrial extermination, it is necessary to go back to November 1942, to the moment when the Germans arrested him after 3 years of avoiding deportation. Tauber had spent those 3 years in hiding, moving between the Kraków ghetto and improvised shelters while the rest of his extended family disappeared into transports. His capture came in an ordinary way: an inspection, papers that were not enough, a train heading south through Poland whose final destination he already knew, even though no one told him. Auschwitz was then receiving thousands of people each week, and the arrival procedure followed a logic the newly detained could not decipher in the moment. One line separated from another. An officer pointed with 2 fingers to the left or to the right, and that gesture decided whether someone would live a few more hours or a few more months. Tauber ended up on the side of those who would live a few more months. He was registered, his head was shaved, and he was assigned a number. Around him, on the same ramp, other men, women, and children from the same transport walked in the opposite direction, toward a low building with a chimney that most interpreted as an ordinary industrial installation. No one in Tauber's line yet knew that chimney would define the rest of his life. During his first weeks, he worked in the camp workshops, one of countless anonymous prisoners absorbed into the machinery of slave labor, sustaining the German war economy. That stage did not last long. One day, an SS non-commissioned officer walked along the line of prisoners during roll call and asked, without explaining why, who had experience with furnaces, boilers, fire, or metalwork. Tauber raised his hand. He did not know that answer would separate him forever from the rest of the camp. That was how selection for the Sonderkommando worked in most documented cases. It was neither a declared punishment nor a declared reward, but a technical question disguised as an administrative formality. SS officers needed young men, physically resilient, with some knowledge of trades involving fire, metals, or construction. Sometimes selection took place directly on the arrival ramp, among men who had just stepped off the train and did not yet even know where they were. Sometimes, as in Tauber's case, it happened weeks later, among prisoners who had already spent time inside the camp and whom the SS considered sufficiently acclimatized to undertake work demanding physical endurance and a certain capacity for mechanical obedience. In no case was the task explained in advance. That was discovered later, after crossing a door from which there was no return. The men who had passed through that door before Tauber later described, in post-war interviews, an almost uniform reaction during the first hours: disbelief, followed by such a powerful physical revulsion that many refused food during their first days, unable to swallow while the smell of the furnaces remained embedded in their clothing and skin. The veterans of the group, the few who had been there longer, warned newcomers that this revulsion had a practical limit. Refusing to work, or simply collapsing from starvation, meant being immediately replaced by another body capable of maintaining the pace. The camp waited for no one. Tauber learned that lesson during his first shifts, watching men who had arrived with him break down in front of the task and disappear soon afterward, replaced without ceremony by the next selection. The logic behind the Sonderkommando was not a bureaucratic accident. After experimenting with different methods of extermination during the early years of the war, the SS had reached a practical conclusion. Killing thousands of people a day was technically possible, but handling the bodies afterward required an amount of labor that no German officer was willing to provide with German personnel. The work was exhausting, repulsive, endless, The solution was to delegate it to the system's own victims. If Jews died in the chambers, other Jews would remove the bodies, prepare them for incineration, feed the furnaces, crush the bones that had not completely burned, and disperse the ashes. The delegation served two functions at once. It spared SS officers from physical work they preferred not to perform, and it turned prisoners themselves into part of the mechanism producing their collective extermination, making any later clean testimony about who had done what more difficult. By the time Tauber arrived at Auschwitz, that mechanism had already been refined through months of trial and error. The first mass gassings at the camp had been carried out in improvised facilities, converted farmhouses near Birkenau that prisoners simply called the bunkers. The capacity of those first installations proved insufficient for the volume of deportations the SS projected for 1,943, and the German company Topf und Söhne was commissioned to design and construct 4 new crematorium complexes within the Birkenau perimeter, each combining in a single building the undressing room, gas chamber, and incineration furnaces. That integration into one physical space was itself a decision of efficiency. It minimized the movement of bodies, reduced the time between death and the disappearance of the corpse, and concentrated in a small number of men, the Sonderkommando, the entire process, from the entrance of the living to the dispersal of the dead's ashes. The day Tauber first crossed the door of a crematorium, there was no prior explanation, no gradual instruction. He was placed directly in front of the work. Before that work began, another group of prisoners, sometimes the same Sonderkommando men, sometimes a separate team assigned specifically to the task, received the deportees in the undressing room adjoining the gas chamber. Signs in several languages indicated that the room led to showers and disinfection. Numbered hooks on the walls invited people to hang their clothes carefully so they could retrieve them afterward. Some personnel, trained to preserve the illusion as long as possible, advised the new arrivals to remember their hook number and calmly answered questions about how long the shower would take. The lie worked best the more ordinary it seemed. And that fabricated normality was, for the men who had to maintain it shift after shift, one of the hardest parts of the entire task to endure. And the work, in its most basic form, consisted of this. Once a group of people had finished suffocating inside the gas chamber, someone had to enter, open the sealed doors, ventilate the room for the minimum time necessary, and begin removing the bodies. The corpses were usually piled toward the corners and upward because the gas acted from the floor, and in their last moments of consciousness, people climbed over one another, searching for air that no longer existed anywhere in the room. Separating them was brutally physical work, done by hand, often while slipping in the bodily fluids released during death by asphyxiation. The air inside the chamber, even after ventilation, remained saturated with a chemical smell that clung to clothing and skin for hours, and the men of the Sonderkommando learned to recognize it from a distance, long before crossing the door, as the unmistakable sign that another group had just died. The silence after death had a different quality from the silence of any other moment in the camp. There were no screams, no constant noise of roll calls or barking guard dogs, only the sound of the Sonderkommando men themselves, moving among the bodies, breathing through improvised masks that in the early years of the camp did not even exist as standard protection. Work inside each crematorium was organized according to a precise internal hierarchy, modeled on the capo system that governed the rest of the camp. A prisoner designated as foreman in the shift where Tauber worked, a man named Mietek Morawa, directly supervised the groups responsible for each stage of the process, in turn answering to SS non-commissioned officers who remained in the building during the busiest hours, generally without taking part in the physical work and limiting themselves to ensuring that the pace did not slow. This internal structure, with prisoners supervising other prisoners, reproduced within the Sonderkommando itself the same logic of control the SS applied to the camp as a whole. Delegate discipline downward, keep German hands as far as possible from the dirty work, and ensure that any failure was resolved among the prisoners themselves before an officer had to intervene directly. After the bodies were removed came inspection. A separate group, under direct SS supervision, examined mouths for gold dental work, cut women's hair for sale to the German textile industry, and searched for any valuables hidden among the clothing the victims had left in the undressing room only minutes earlier, believing they were going to take a shower. Every element of the body had a different administrative destination. Dental gold was melted into bars inside the Auschwitz complex itself and periodically transferred to Reichsbank accounts in Berlin, as though it were any other precious metal recovered from an ordinary industrial operation. Hair was packed into sacks and sent to German textile factories, where it was processed into felt and thread intended, among other uses, for industry and the military. Clothing and personal belongings that deportees had carefully hung in the undressing room, convinced they would return to collect them. Accumulated in a separate sector of the camp, the prisoners themselves had given an ironic name, Canada, a reference to the wealth and abundance that country represented in popular imagination at the time. There, another group of prisoners sorted suitcases, clothes, family photographs, toys, and documents through endless workdays that turned the entire lives of hundreds of thousands of people into orderly piles arranged according to administrative categories. Nothing was wasted, and this economy of total exploitation was itself part of what the Sonderkommando had to carry out or witness with their own hands. Then came the transport to the furnaces. Bodies were loaded onto iron stretchers and carried to the mouths of the cremation furnaces, where another group of Sonderkommando men fed them into the ovens and maintained the temperature necessary for incineration to be completed. Tauber would later describe, in the same technical tone he used for everything, how workers learned to regulate the process according to the physical condition of each body, how they distinguished between corpses that burned more easily and others that required more furnace time, how bone fragments that did not burn completely were later removed and ground into a fine powder that was then dispersed into the Vistula River, nearby fields, or used as fill in marshy areas of the Birkenau complex itself. Crematoria 2 and SE, the largest in the complex, each had 15 furnace openings arranged in 5 triple-chamber units. Crematoria IV and V, smaller, had 8 openings each, with a different design intended to allow faster loading though, with lower individual capacity per furnace. Taken together, the 4 installations could theoretically incinerate several thousand bodies per day during periods of greatest demand, a figure the SS adjusted according to the volume of transports arriving by train from across occupied Europe. Each crematorium operating at full capacity could process several thousand bodies in a single day when transports arrived en masse. That volume required the Sonderkommando to work long shifts with almost no breaks and required the number of men assigned to the task to grow in parallel with the pace of deportations. In 1943, the group consisted of several hundred men distributed among the different Birkenau crematoria. The number remained relatively stable during that year, with periodic replacements that Tauber would soon discover were neither random nor occasional, but part of a deliberate mechanism. The mechanism was this. A man who worked in the Sonderkommando for weeks or months accumulated knowledge possessed by no prisoner in the general camp. He knew exactly how the gas chambers worked. He knew the names of the officers who supervised mass executions. He knew the true scale of extermination, the numbers the SS wanted to keep hidden even within their own system of secrecy. That knowledge turned every member of the Sonderkommando into a potential witness, and a potential witness was, in SS logic, a risk that had to be eliminated before it could become a real problem. That was why, every few months, an entire Sonderkommando group was led into the same gas chambers they had operated and replaced by a new group that began the cycle from zero, not yet knowing that its expiration date had already been fixed from the first day. The first major documented liquidation of the Birkenau Sonderkommando occurred in December 1942, only weeks after Tauber began his work. An entire group, composed of the men who had operated the system since its first months, was exterminated in a single procedure. In 1943, there were at least 2 more liquidations, each eliminating all or most of the personnel active up to that point. Surviving a liquidation did not bring relief. In immediate practical terms, it meant inheriting the task of cleaning up after what remained of the previous group, recognizing among the bodies men with whom one had shared rations, shifts, and silence for months. Tauber would later describe that cycle as the most psychologically difficult part of his entire time in the Sonderkommando, more difficult even than working with transports of strangers. The recurring certainty that every new companion, every new friendship formed under those extreme conditions had an expiration date no one announced in advance. The procedure for carrying out a liquidation was not announced as such. The selected men were told they were being transferred to another camp, or that they would be assigned different work in another part of the complex. They were told to form orderly lines, surrender any valuables they had accumulated, and walk toward the same type of undressing room through which they had watched thousands of people pass before them. Some understood what was happening on the way. Others understood only when they reached the door. By then, there was no way to stop the procedure, and the men on the following shift, those who remained alive because they had not been included on that list, were the ones who had to deal afterward with the bodies of their own companions. Tauber survived all these liquidations, not because he had found a way to evade the system, but because his specific technical knowledge, precise operation of the furnaces, detailed understanding of the installations made him a resource that the men responsible for each crematorium preferred to keep rather than replace. For almost 2 years, that technical usefulness was the only variable that kept him alive while generation after generation of companions disappeared around him. The average life expectancy of a Sonderkommando member at Auschwitz-Birkenau was around 3 months. According to calculations, later reconstructed by camp historians from documented replacement cycles between 1942 and 1944. Tauber, with almost 2 years of active service, was a statistical anomaly he himself could never fully explain. He was not stronger than other men who had died much earlier. He was not more disciplined or more obedient. He was simply one of the few whose specific technical knowledge matched exactly what each new crematorium supervisor needed to preserve when it came time to decide who stayed and who did not. Daily coexistence with death on that scale produced a form of isolation no other group of prisoners experienced in the same way. The Sonderkommando men were housed separately from the rest of the camp, in specific barracks near the Crematoria, under strict prohibition from communicating with other prisoners. They received slightly larger rations than prisoners in the general camp, had access to objects left behind by deportees' food, better quality clothing, sometimes alcohol or cigarettes that circulated through an internal barter market, and this materially less brutal treatment served a precise purpose: to keep them physically capable of sustaining exhausting work while deepening the psychological isolation that separated them from every other prisoner in the camp. No one else in Auschwitz lived like that. No one else ate so well while doing work so terrible. Surviving that routine mentally required some kind of anchor, and different survivors from the same group later agreed that this anchor was usually another man or a small group of men, with whom one could silently share what could not be shared with anyone else. Tauber found that anchor in 2 brothers, Shlomo and Abraham Dragon, who were also selected for the Sonderkommando around the same period. The 3 ate together when they could, covered for one another during the hardest shifts, and maintained a silent watch over one another's physical and mental condition, aware that the collapse of any one of them could mean immediate replacement. That alliance, formed during the first months of shared work, would remain intact for almost 2 years, until it became decisive in the only real escape none of the 3 had ever fully been able to plan. The barracks where they slept, built beside the crematoria themselves, had a strange atmosphere unlike any other part of the camp. At night, between shifts, an internal market circulated objects recovered from transports, canned food, medicines, cigarettes, sometimes alcohol clandestinely distilled with whatever means were available. This access to material goods, unimaginable for the rest of Auschwitz's prisoners, coexisted without any apparent contradiction with the fact that those same men spent the next day feeding into the fire the bodies of those who had unknowingly left behind the objects now circulating among them. Tauber learned to live inside that contradiction because there was no alternative. The alternative was to stop eating, stop sleeping, stop sustaining the body, and the body was the only thing he could still decide to keep under his control. Refusing to work was not a real option. Documented cases of prisoners who tried to resist at the moment of selection, or refused to carry out a specific task once inside the Sonderkommando, ended in immediate execution, often in front of the rest of the group as an explicit warning about what happened to insubordination. The message did not need to be repeated. Discipline rested on a simple principle. Any refusal was resolved with a bullet or immediate dispatch to the same gas chamber the man himself had operated for others only minutes earlier. The only way to truly escape the work, beyond all possibility of negotiation, was suicide, and there were cases of men who chose it after recognizing among the bodies they were processing a relative, a neighbor, someone from the same street in their hometown. Tauber saw this happen more than once. According to his later testimony, it was never something that could be openly discussed within the group. Each man carried those scenes in silence, because talking about them changed nothing and only added weight to a burden already impossible to bear. The SS supervisors also had a deliberate method for ensuring that no newly incorporated man could later claim distance from what happened inside the crematorium. From his first shift, he was forced to participate directly in one of the harshest parts of the process, so that responsibility would be distributed and no new member could sustain, even before himself, the idea that he had merely been a spectator. This logic of forced involvement functioned as a second mechanism of control, as effective as the direct threat of death. It turned each man's subsequent silence into a form of self-protection, because speaking also meant confessing his own participation in a system from which no one inside the Sonderkommando had been able to remain apart. Throughout that period, Tauber did not remain in a single installation. He worked successively in the original crematorium of Auschwitz-I, the oldest and first to begin operating, and was later transferred to Birkenau, where he worked in Crematoria II, IV, and V as staffing needs shifted from one building to another. Every transfer meant adapting to a different physical layout, a different foreman, a different group of companions, in a constant movement that prevented any illusion of stability, even within the most brutal routine. The transfers also meant accumulating, shift after shift, a complete mental map of the entire system, something very few men ever possessed. Not just how one crematorium worked, but how all four worked, with their differences in design, capacity, and procedure. The physical wear of the work left marks that were not always immediately visible. Minor burns to hands and forearms, caused by constant contact with the furnace openings, became chronic among men who had spent months on the job. Prolonged exposure to extreme heat and residual combustion gases damaged breathing, and several Sonderkommando members developed lung problems no camp doctor bothered to treat. Tauber carried those physical consequences in the same silent way he carried everything else, without the relative comfort of better rations or recovered goods ever compensating for the real price his body paid to maintain the required pace. As 1943 progressed into 1944, the pace of deportations intensified abruptly. The mass deportation of Hungarian Jews, beginning in May 1944, brought more than 400,000 people to Birkenau in less than 3 months. All 4 crematoria in the complex operated with virtually no interruption during that period, and the Sonderkommando expanded to more than 900 men, the highest number the system would ever reach. By then, Tauber had already spent more than a year and a half inside the mechanism, an exceptional survival that placed him among a handful of men who had watched several complete generations of companions come and go without themselves being replaced. During those months from May to July 1944, smoke from the crematoria became visible from kilometers away, and the smell produced by continuous incineration settled permanently over the Birkenau complex, reaching even the barracks of the general camp that had no direct connection to extermination work. The Sonderkommando men worked shifts extending far beyond what their bodies could sustain, and physical exhaustion began claiming victims within the group itself. Men collapsing in the middle of a shift, losing the coordination needed to handle iron stretchers safely, burning their hands and arms because of mistakes caused by fatigue in front of the furnace openings. Tauber, together with the Dragon brothers, belonged to the core group of men who had already spent more than a year inside the system, and that accumulated experience made them constant points of reference for newcomers who arrived in waves whenever the volume of Hungarian transports demanded more hands. The summer of 1944 was, according to several survivors of the same group, the moment when most understood that their own liquidation was only a matter of time. No one needed to announce it. The logic of the system was readable to anyone who had spent long enough inside it. When the volume of Hungarian transports ended in July, crematorium activity declined, and in the brutal arithmetic of the camp, that reduction meant the Sonderkommando was no longer as necessary as before. A group that was too large, knew too much, and was no longer essential to maintaining the pace of extermination was exactly the kind of risk the SS preferred to eliminate before it became a problem. Within this climate of growing tension, one section of the Sonderkommando began preparing, with the same methodical care they applied to their forced labor, a plan for armed resistance. The preparation had been underway for months, identifying tools inside the crematoria that could be used as weapons, establishing discrete signals of communication among the 4 buildings that operated independently, and above all, obtaining gunpowder that a group of women working in a nearby munitions factory managed to smuggle in tiny quantities, hidden in clothing hems and at the bottom of food containers. According to records reconstructed after the war, Tauber took part in this preparatory underground organization, helping identify which materials in the crematorium could be useful and maintaining. Like the others involved, absolute silence in front of anyone not directly part of the plan. Betrayal was a permanent risk, and a single misplaced word could destroy the entire plan prematurely. He did not take part in the direct fighting on the 7th of October 1944, when a group of men attacked the guards of Crematorium 4 with improvised tools and the explosives they had managed to accumulate, partially destroying one of the 4 installations before the revolt was crushed within hours. Hundreds of men died that day, and in the days that followed, executed in direct retaliation. Crematorium IV was permanently put out of service. The other 3 continued to operate, and Tauber, together with the Dragon Brothers, continued working in them, now as part of an even smaller group, even more aware that every additional week of life was an exception within a system designed to leave no exceptions. Tauber survived that purge as well. By January 1945, when the Red Army's advance forced the SS to begin the general evacuation of the Auschwitz complex, he was already one of the very few men who had survived almost the entire operational history of the Sonderkommando without being eliminated. The SS then decided to empty the camp before the Soviets arrived and organized columns of prisoners who had to march on foot in the middle of the Polish winter toward camps farther west. Those marches, which history would come to call death marches, killed prisoners through cold, exhaustion, and the bullets of guards who executed anyone unable to keep pace. The column in which Tauber and the Dragon Brothers marched left Auschwitz in the middle of January, with temperatures far below freezing and without adequate clothing. The SS guards escorting the march shot without warning at any prisoner who stopped, stumbled, and could not get up in time, or simply seemed unable to keep up with the group. Bodies remained along the sides of the road, and the column continued forward without stopping for them, in a frozen repetition of the same principle that had governed their entire lives inside the camp. Whoever could not maintain the pace disappeared. At some point during the march, amid the confusion of night and a column that had stretched too far for the guards to control every section with equal attention, the 3 men found the opening they had been unable for months even to imagine as a real possibility. They slipped into the darkness, away from the beams of German flashlights, and walked for hours without knowing whether anyone was pursuing them, or whether they simply no longer mattered enough for anyone to bother searching for them among hundreds of columns scattered across the Polish countryside. They found an isolated farm before dawn. Weakened, their feet damaged by the march and the cold, they entered with no strength left to negotiate anything. 2 people were inside. In a reversal that completely inverted the relationship of power Tauber and the Dragon Brothers had lived under for almost 2 years of absolute SS control. This time, they were the ones who imposed the terms. They would remain at the farm, use the food and shelter available, and the 2 people living there would have no choice but to accept it while they waited for news from the front. The wait did not last long. The Soviet advance moved quickly during that winter of 1945, and within days artillery, followed by Red Army infantry units, reached the area. Tauber and the Dragon Brothers emerged from the farm and, from one day to the next, became free men, something none of the 3 had been for years. But freedom, for someone who had spent almost 2 years inside the most efficient mechanism of extermination ever built, did not simply mean returning home. It meant carrying knowledge possessed by very few human beings in the world and deciding what to do with it. Tauber decided to speak. He returned to the Auschwitz area soon after the complex had been fully liberated, when Polish authorities began organizing a formal investigation into what had happened in the camp. He gave his first statement to a Soviet commission at the end of February 1945, only weeks after escaping from the death march. It was a brief testimony, taken amid the administrative chaos of a war that had not yet completely ended, and it could barely begin to suggest the scale of what Tauber had witnessed. Weeks later, he gave a second, more extensive statement to the Jewish Historical Commission in Krakow, recording names and dates, while memory was still fresh and before the passage of time began to blur the most precise details. The decisive statement came on the 24th of May 1945, when he sat before Judge Jan Sayan in Krakow to give the longest and most detailed testimony he would ever provide. Hours spent describing point by point the physical layout of the crematoria, the complete procedure from the arrival of a transport to the final dispersal of the ashes, the names of the officers he had seen operating the system, the exact functioning of a mechanism deliberately designed to leave no living witnesses. The investigators who later studied that testimony, comparing it with the original Topf, plans the German company that had manufactured the cremation furnaces, and with the physical remains of the installations the SS had tried to destroy before fleeing, agreed on something exceptional. Tauber's description matched with a precision no other available testimony reached. The French historian Jean-Claude Pressat, who spent years reconstructing the exact engineering of the Auschwitz extermination system from German technical documentation, would decades later rank Tauber's testimony above any other available record of the internal operation of the Birkenau crematoria. This was not the memory of someone who had seen the horror from a distance. It was the memory of someone who had operated the machinery with his own hands, day after day, for longer than almost any other man in his position had managed to survive. That testimony was not simply archived and left unused. It became part of the documentary foundation later employed in judicial proceedings seeking to hold accountable the officers who had directed the system, including the trial of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss himself, and later cases in West Germany against other members of the SS personnel who had supervised the crematoria. Tauber, however, did not testify again in later years with the same level of detail. After 1945, he settled for a time in Munich with his brother Bendit, whom he had managed to bring out of the Soviet Union, where he had been detained since the first days of the German invasion of Poland in 1939. Together they opened a small business tanning and selling leather, an ordinary trade completely removed from anything connected with what Tauber had done for almost 2 years inside Birkenau. In 1952, the two brothers sold the business and crossed the Atlantic aboard a ship bound for the United States. There, Henrik Tauber became Henry Fuchs, permanently adopting his father's surname and leaving behind, at least in the name he would use from then on, the one he had carried during the years of the camp. He lived the rest of his life quietly, without seeking public exposure, without turning his story into a narrative he repeated in forums or interviews. In the United States, he rebuilt an ordinary life, with work, routine, and the kind of anonymity that after Auschwitz must have seemed less like a luxury than a silent form of justice against a system designed precisely so that men like him would never have any life afterward. The few who encountered him during those later years described him as a reserved man who preferred to let his testimony speak for itself, preserved forever in the pages of a statement signed in Krakow in May 1945. He died in January 2000, more than 5 decades after first crossing the door of a crematorium, without yet knowing that he would become one of the few men in history capable of describing, with the precision of someone who knows every screw in a machine, exactly how the mechanism Auschwitz had built to make 1 million people disappear was supposed to function without leaving, in theory, a single trace or a single witness. One remained, and that witness chose to speak before returning, forever, to the silence that had sustained him inside the camp.